The door gives way on the third kick. Iron shrieks against stone, frost explodes from the hinges, and the cold Andean air rushes into a darkness that was never meant for Spaniards. The first man through, an alferez barely more than a boy, tastes dust and rancid fat on his tongue. His breath ghosts in front of him, mixing with the sour, sweet, heavy smell of dried maize, chino potatoes, and llama tallow that has waited here, undisturbed, for a campaign that will now never come. His boots crunch not on coins, but on kernels scattered across the floor. He mutters a curse in Extremaduran Spanish, "Where is the silver?" and shoves his pike into the nearest wicker basket. It rips with a dry sigh, maize cascading out like a yellow waterfall. Behind him, in the doorway's frame of blue-white mountain light, another figure is forced to his knees. He is older, wrapped in a thick, patterned lajla, the woven cloth of a bureaucrat rather than a warrior. His hands are bound behind his back with a rawhide thong, but his eyes move like a man counting. This is the quipu, the keeper of the knots. The alferez does not know the word, only that this Indian is supposed to explain what is valuable here. To the left of the entrance, bolted into the stone by a wooden peg polished by generations of passing hands, hangs something that looks to the Spaniards like a horse's tail married to a rosary. A thick primary cord, from which dangle dozens of thinner cords in different colors, browns, reds, faded yellows, some cotton pale, some the greasy gray of llama wool. On several of those cords, near the top, the fibers are stained a darker, almost blackened brown, as if long ago they were soaked in sweat, or smoke, or blood. The alferez reaches out and tugs one of the pendants. The entire thing sways, rustling faintly, as if answering in a language made of friction and fiber. He frowns. No coins, no jewels. Just knots. He almost walks past it. But one of his men laughs and calls it, the Indian's rosary, and so, amused, he drags the kneeling Andean forward by the hair and jabs his sword at the dangling cords. ¿Qué es esto? What is this? The quipu draws in a slow, careful breath against the thin air of the northern highlands. Outside, beyond the warehouse, beyond this single-state calca, snow crowns the black ribs of the Andes, and somewhere many days' march away, in the city of Cajamarca, his living god Atahualpa sits in a stone room, a prisoner being ransomed with rooms filling with gold. Here, in this cold storehouse, the god's nervous system is being cut. The quipu leans his forehead against the stone threshold as if greeting a shrine. Then he looks up at the cords. He sees what the Spaniard cannot, not string, but census. Not tassels, but the breathing record of who has sown, who has reaped, who has marched, who has bled. In these knots are the names of households, the obligations of villages, the weight of maize that should sit in this warehouse and in the next, marching down the royal road like an invisible caravan. He tries to explain, in a Quechua thick with terror, that this is not treasure. It is something more dangerous, memory. The alferez hears only an old man babbling. Behind them, Spanish voices echo among the stone pillars as soldiers hack open more baskets, laughing as dried peppers scatter, as textiles spill, a riot of pattern and color, fine come-by cloth that in this world is as good as gold. But the officer is disappointed. Where are the ingots? Where is the silver you can weigh, the gold you can melt? The quipu, still on his knees in the frost, watches the maize tumble, the careful accounting of 3 harvests kicked into the dust by boots that do not yet understand what they are breaking. His heart is racing, not just for himself, but for the garrisons farther up the road, for the road crews, for the villages that believe these storehouses will be full when the next frost comes. If these calca are emptied without record, there will be hunger along the Capac Nan like a sickness. I want you to hold that image, one frightened man, one puzzled officer, and a hanging quipu swaying gently in the dim light of a plundered warehouse. Because in those cords is the operating system of the largest empire the Americas had ever seen, and it ran, astonishingly, without coins, without markets as we know them, and without writing in the alphabetic sense. Welcome back to Archives of Humanity. I'm Professor Adrian Lockwell, your time detective. Today we are not just walking the roads of the Inca. We are dissecting a system, an economy that tried to coordinate millions of lives with fiber, breath, and duty instead of money. We are standing in the war room of a moneyless empire at the precise moment its enemies have put their hands on its nervous system and have no idea what they're holding. Our cast is crowded. Here in the Calca, we have the unnamed alferez, hungry for plunder, whose world makes sense only when wealth is metal you can carry. We have the quipu, whose power lives not in a sword, but in his trained fingers and trained memory. Far away, Atahualpa, Sapa Inca, unique Inca, the living son of the sun, sits captive, calculating whether filling Spanish rooms with gold will save him. Francisco Pizarro paces, counting days and ingots, weighing whether it is safer to keep a god alive or to kill him. Beyond them, millions of peasants, road builders, terrace farmers, herders, and soldiers live by a rhythm of obligations measured in workdays, not wages. Every day Atahualpa remains in that stone room. Spanish power stretches further along Inca roads, chasca runners carrying not only Inca orders, but now Spanish demands and rumors, along stone-paved arteries the invaders never built. Every day, the calendars slip, the MITA labor drafts get delayed, planting windows shift, warehouses are opened at the wrong time, under the wrong authority. The clock of an empire that prided itself on order is beginning to stutter. At the center of our investigation lies a sharp question that has divided historians, ideologues, and dreamers for 5 centuries. How did the Inca build, in less than 100 years, an empire stretching some 4,000 kilometers from what is now Colombia down through Peru into Chile and Argentina, Tawantinsuyu, the land of the 4 quarters, without metal coinage, with almost no independent urban markets, and without writing as Eurasia knew it? And why did that extraordinary machine, admired by some later planners as an almost frictionless command economy, shatter so quickly that within a single brutal generation it went from invincible to administered by its conquerors? Was Tawantinsuyu a brilliant alternative to markets, a high-trust, high-care, non-monetary system that proves humans don't need money to coordinate at scale? Or was it a brittle palace of knots and orders, a command economy waiting for the first serious shock to crumble? To answer that, we have to move from that single quipu on the wall out along the roads it served, into the files of colonial courts, the excavated terraces on wind-scoured hills, and the debates of modern historians arguing over what those knots really meant. Imagine climbing out of that warehouse into the highland morning. Your breath burns in your lungs, the air is thin, metallic. To the west, far below, a strip of coastal desert, to the east, the green blur of cloud forest. Tawantinsuyu's genius began with geography. The empire did not sit on one generous plain, like the Nile or the Euphrates. It stretched across stacked ecozones, chacras on high terraces growing potatoes and quinoa, lower valleys with maize, the coca-growing yungas clinging to cloud-wet slopes, llama herds on the bleak puna grasslands, fisheries on a desert coast fed by the Humboldt Current. No single valley could feed itself reliably year after year. The solution was roads. The Capac Nan, the Royal Road, and its sisters ran more than 25,000 kilometers, stone-paved in places, carved into steps-up cliff faces, stitched over gorges with rope suspension bridges woven from ichu grass, thick as a man's torso. Along these roads stood tampu, way stations where travelers could eat and sleep, and calca, the state warehouses like the one just looted, placed every 20 to 30 kilometers in key regions. They were not random granaries. They were a grid. And running along that grid, the packets in Tawantinsuyu's network, were the chasca, relay runners who could cover more than 200 kilometers a day by passing messages and small bundles between them, sprinting from tampu to tampu, quipu cords bouncing against their chests. The Inca state did not mint coins, it minted obligations. The core tax was the mita. Instead of paying in metal, each household owed the state a quota of labor days. A village might send men to build or repair roads, to maintain terraces on state and temple lands, to serve in the army, to work in mines, to herd state llamas. Women might weave state textiles, brew chicha beer for festivals, or work in state workshops. This labor tax was calibrated. Quipu recorded the number of people in each Alu, kin group, and their ability to work, dividing them into age and sex categories. The knots on a village's quipu were not abstract numerals, they were, quite literally, the fingers of the state reaching into every household's calendar. In return, the state promised something radically different from laissez-faire. It promised that no one would go hungry if the harvest failed. Staple goods, maize, chuno, textiles, weapons, tools, were moved into Kalka and then redistributed as needed. When a frost hit one valley, supplies could be brought in from another ecozone. When an army marched, its food and clothing had been prepositioned like pieces on a chessboard months earlier. Disaster relief was not charity, it was a line item in the empire's muscle memory. Local markets did exist. In Quechua towns, Hatton markets appeared, especially at crossroads and urban centers, trading salt, fish from the coast, coca leaves from the east, small luxury goods, and surplus produce. But for basic survival, for grain, for cloth, for security, the primary broker was not a merchant guild. It was the Sapa Inca and his bureaucracy of cords. We have, in other words, something that looks, at first glance, like a centrally planned economy avant la lettre. Labor quotas instead of wages. Warehouses instead of wholesalers. Runners instead of postal banks. But at the heart of that planning system was our artifact, the quipu. Step closer to it. Rub the fibers between your fingertips. You feel the twist of spun cotton, or sometimes of camelid wool stripped from alpaca or llama. Each pendant cord carries clusters of knots, figure-8 knots, long knots, simple overhands. Place value is encoded from the bottom up, units, tens, hundreds, thousands. A trained quipu fingers can run along a cord and, with no ink, summon a census. Spanish chroniclers did not agree on what exactly these cords contained. Some saw mere abacuses, mnemonic aids for accountants who already knew the story by heart. Others, particularly indigenous informants speaking to Spanish priests, insisted that historical epics, laws, and even poetry could be read from select quipus by experts. Modern scholars are divided. One camp, led by figures like Gary Urton and Manuel Medrano, argues that quipus could operate as a kind of structured writing system, a database, if you like, whose columns are colors and not types and whose rows are chords. In one famous case, researchers compared a cluster of 17th-century quipus with a Spanish alphabetic census of an Andean village. They found striking correlations. The numbers and ordering on the cords appeared to match individual households listed in the paper record, suggesting that a specific pendant cord might represent a named family, its tributary obligations defined by knot position and perhaps cord color. If that is right, then at least some quipus were far more than ledgers of how much maize sat in which storehouse. They were, in principle, capable of encoding referential information, names, statuses, perhaps even phonetic elements. That would make them a fully fledged writing system, albeit one alien to quills and parchment. Another camp insists on caution. They point out that every colonial-era description of quipu reading involves a living quipu interpreting the knots aloud. Without his commentary, the chords are ambiguous. Color categories can differ between regions, the same pattern might be used for different purposes depending on context. Early Spanish administrators often called the quipus reminders, or aids, not texts in themselves. In this view, a quipu is more like a sophisticated spreadsheet that only makes sense to someone who already knows which column is widows and which is llamas. A third, hybrid position sees no contradiction. Quipus, these scholars argue, encoded high-density, structured quantitative data, numbers of people, loads of cargo, harvest yields, but they were always embedded in an oral, social environment. Like a modern enterprise database, the raw bits mean nothing without the living bureaucracy that defines the schema. And that point becomes vivid when we look at law. In colonial court records, we find quipus presented as evidence in disputes over land, labor, and tribute. An indigenous community might bring its cords before a Spanish judge, and a quipucamaic would read them to prove that under Inca rule, this field belonged to that alu, or that only 10 men, not 20, owed labor in a certain season. Sometimes the Spanish official accepted the knots as legitimate documentation. Sometimes he waved them away as pagan curiosities. Here, in miniature, we see both the authority and the fragility of knotted memory. Within the Andean world, these cords could decide who paid, who worked, who owned. Under the new regime, their power depended on the willingness of an outsider to believe in fiber rather than ink. So what kind of society did such an operating system create? Was Tawantinsuyu a kind of highland utopia, a moneyless commonwealth without beggars, as some chroniclers insist? Or was it a prison without walls, in which every household's time was knotted into a schedule from which there was no escape? The Inca's own official narrative, preserved in part through loyalist nobles dictating to men like Garcilaso de la Vega, is flattering. They tell of storehouses so full that grain spoiled before it could be used. They describe roads so safe that a young woman could walk alone carrying gold and never be molested. They stress that the Sapa Inca was like a shepherd to his people, ensuring that no one went hungry. And there is archaeological support for some of this: granaries on high, cold hillsides positioned to keep grain dry and cool, evidence that in many regions, Inca imperial rule coincided with improved food security compared to the preceding patchwork of warring chiefdoms. But that is only one face of the system. Look at the Mitmakuna, whole communities uprooted and resettled by imperial decree. This policy moved loyal populations into newly conquered regions to colonize and civilize them, and rebellious groups out of their homelands to break their capacity for coordinated resistance. Imagine waking up to find out that your entire village is being marched hundreds of kilometers away to build terraces on a frontier you have never seen, while strangers occupy the fields of your ancestors. That, too, is Inca order. The law was harsh. Theft from state storehouses could mean mutilation or death. Adultery, drunkenness at the wrong time, or disrespect to authority could be punished with stoning, strangulation, or being thrown from a cliff. Sumptuary laws were precise: only certain classes could wear fine come-by cloth, certain patterns were reserved for nobility, certain headdresses for specific ranks. The body itself was a page on which hierarchy was written in thread and feather. 20th century debates over the Inca economy mirrored broader ideological battles. On one side were those who romanticized Tawantinsuyu as a kind of proto-socialist utopia, a planned society without money, where cooperation replaced competition, the sick and elderly were cared for, and famine was rare thanks to state provisioning. Revolutionary movements in Latin America sometimes invoked the Inca past as proof that egalitarian, communal life was rooted in indigenous tradition, not foreign theory. On the other side, anthropologists like John Mura emphasized what he called the vertical archipelago, Andean societies, and then the Inca state, organized access to multiple ecological zones vertically up and down the mountains, extracting surpluses from each to feed the center. In this interpretation, the Inca state was first and foremost a military bureaucratic extraction machine. Yes, it built terraces and stored grain, but the first beneficiaries were the royal court, the priesthood, and the standing army. Ordinary communities performed maize labor not as free citizens, but as subjects whose autonomy had been narrowed by conquest. A third line of scholarship, represented by historians like Maria Rostworowski, resists both the rosy utopia and the monolithic extraction machine. They point to intense local variation, some ethnic lords eagerly aligned with Cuzco, using imperial backing to settle old scores or elevate their status, others resisted bitterly, negotiating every labor demand, sometimes staging revolts. The Inca Empire, in this view, functioned less as a single steel cage and more as a constantly renegotiated contract among hundreds of polities and lineages, mediated through marriages, hostages, gifts, and yes, quipus recording who owed what. One thing is clear: by the early 16th century, long before Pizarro's men kicked open that warehouse door, the system was under strain. Archaeology reveals burned villages on some frontiers, hastily rebuilt fortresses, signs of resistance to expansion. Spanish sources, too, mention rebellions that had to be put down with force. Some Andean groups, especially those recently conquered, would later ally with the Spaniards not out of naivete, but because they saw in these newcomers a chance to escape Cusco's net, misjudging, of course, the nature of the new web being spun. Then came the invisible invader. Around the 1520s, smallpox and other Eurasian diseases began to move southward from Panama, carried by traders and early raiding expeditions long before Pizarro himself reached Peru. The disease raced along the same networks the Inca had so carefully built: roads, exchange routes, relay stations. It struck Cusco and the royal family with particular cruelty. Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca who had extended Tawantinsuyu to its greatest territorial reach, died, apparently of smallpox, far from the capital. So did his designated heir. The empire's succession protocol, never fully routinized, broke. Two sons, Huáscar in Cusco and Atahualpa in the northern city of Quito, each claimed legitimacy. What follows is often described simply as a civil war, but it is more accurate to say that the Inca operating system forked. Each claimant used the same tools we have been discussing. Each mobilized MITA labor, each drew down from state Calca, each issued commands along the Capac Nan backed by quipus tallying men and maize. But now the purpose of that mobilization had turned inward. Fields that should have been planted were left untilled because the men were marching. Terraces that needed maintenance were neglected because labor quotas were redirected. Warehouses were emptied not in response to frost or famine, but to feed rival armies. The highly coordinated machine, optimized to project force outward and stabilize the interior, was cannibalizing itself. When Atahualpa finally defeated Huáscar, his victory came atop a landscape already scarred. Elite lineages had been exterminated, loyalties tested, provinces exhausted. It is into this overstressed, depopulated, and divided body that Francisco Pizarro's band of perhaps 168 Spaniards walked in 1532. Traditional narratives focus on the technological shock. Horses, steel swords, arquebus, and cannon at Cajamarca. The image of Atahualpa carried on a litter into the plaza, confident, flanked by unarmed nobles, only to be ambushed, seized, while thousands of his attendants were cut down in a single afternoon. In this telling, the Inca Empire, for all its grandeur, collapses because it has never seen cavalry, never heard gunfire, never faced armored men on warhorses with steel blades. There is truth there. The psychological impact of that massacre was enormous. The ritual center of the world, embodied in Atahualpa, had been manhandled by men who did not recognize his divinity. But another school of thought sees Cajamarca less as the cause and more as the spark landing in tinder piled high by earlier disasters. The Inca system, these historians remind us, was intensely personal. Legitimacy flowed from the person of the Sapa Inca, whose body and regalia anchored cosmic order. The bureaucracy, the MITA, even the quipus themselves were oriented around pleasing or obeying that single center. There was no clear, institutionalized council that could simply swap in another leader without cosmic upheaval. Succession was often contested, the winner rewrote history and reallocated estates. Under such a regime, the death of Huayna Capac from disease, the contested succession, and the brutal civil war were not just political troubles. They were existential shocks to the very logic of the system. When Pizarro captured Atahualpa, he did not just grab a king. He tore out the one remaining pole around which the entire network of obligations was spinning. A third perspective offers a hybrid catastrophe. Yes, the Spaniards brought terrifying new weapons and ruthless tactics. Yes, the Inca system had pre-existing weaknesses, over-centralization, legitimist fragility, limited redundancy. But what made the difference was timing. Had Pizarro arrived 50 years earlier, before smallpox, before the Civil War, he might well have been swallowed whole, one more irritating coastal incursion crushed under massed Andean slings and clubs. Instead, He arrived to find a traumatized giant staggering from internal wounds, its provinces resentful, its noble lineages decimated, its warehouses and quipus already strained by years of misallocation. There is one more forensic clue I want us to linger on, the silencing of the knots themselves. In the first decades after the conquest, Spanish officials actually tried to co-opt quipus. They recognized, grudgingly, that these cords were effective record-keeping tools. Some corregidors supervised indigenous Quipucamayaks who continued to tally tribute and labor obligations, now for the crown of Castile instead of Cuzco. We find references to colonial quipus recording Christian tithes, not just Inca levies. But as the 16th century wore on, the attitude hardened. Zealous priests, worried about idolatry, began to see in the cords not neutral ledgers, but pagan texts preserving heathen rituals and histories. Campaigns of extirpation confiscated and burned quipus along with idols and ritual objects. Legal reforms demanded that legitimate records be kept on paper, in Spanish, using alphabetic writing that most Andean subjects could not yet read. The last generation of native Quipucamayaks died, their pupils forbidden to practice. The living spreadsheet lost its operators. The empire's memory was, quite literally, cut to pieces. And so we must ask, what was it, exactly, that failed? Was it the idea of planning itself? Or something subtler in the pattern of how Tawantinsuyu organized information, power, and trust? Step back and squint. The Inca had achieved something incredible, precision without price signals. They coordinated sowing, harvesting, building, marching, and feeding over vast distances using roads, warehouses, and quipus instead of markets. Chasca runners and Quipucamayaks formed a human information network that functioned as a living bureaucracy with memory. The advantages were obvious. Need a fortress on a frontier ridge? The state could mobilize thousands of workers from multiple provinces, feed them from pre-stocked calca, and finish in a season what might take a scattered, market-based society years. Frost in one valley. Move grain in from another. Drought on the coast. Send highland potatoes down. Private toll-taking, the medieval European curse, was rare, the roads were imperial, the warehouses royal. But there were hidden costs. The system depended on central scheduling and on an assumption that the future would mostly resemble the past. Quipus stored census numbers and quotas from previous years, planners used these to assign new MITA obligations. When festivals, planting times, and labor rotations marched along their usual rhythm, the machine purred. When reality shifted abruptly, when disease wiped out villages, when civil war diverted labor, when climate anomalies struck, the feedback loops were sluggish. Markets, for all their brutality, generate continuous, noisy signals of scarcity and demand through prices. Tawantinsuyu's command system generated signals through reports carried by runners and summarized in knots. When a Quipukamayak died unexpectedly, or a warehouse burned, it was not just a building lost. It was a data loss event. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa exposed a second, deadly vulnerability, a lack of redundancy in sovereignty. There was no accepted council of princes, no strong synod of nobles, no independent judiciary or municipality that could arbitrate a contested succession. Legitimacy was sacral and individual. When that sacred individual's right to rule was doubted, the entire edifice of obedience trembled. Provinces hedged, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Some backed Huáscar, some Atahualpa, some tried to play both sides. The result was paralysis at the very moment the system needed clear, adaptable leadership. Here we encounter one of the most important interpretive battles over the Inca legacy. One reading says, "Look, this is the inevitable fate of over-centralized planning. When the state is the main allocator of essentials, food, cloth, road access, then when the center fails, peripheries starve or defect." The rapid fragmentation of the empire under Spanish pressure, the willingness of some provinces to ally with invaders, the inability to coordinate resistance across the four quarters, all of this, in this view, is the bill coming due for a system that allowed no strong intermediate institutions. Another reading replies, be careful. Almost any society struck by that combination of catastrophes, virgin soil epidemics killing rulers and commoners alike, a lethal civil war, and the arrival of a ruthless foreign force with novel weapons and a religious certainty of its own superiority, would have buckled. The Inca system shows remarkable resilience, in fact, when you look at what survived. Under colonial rule, indigenous communities continued to organize communal labor, to maintain terraces and irrigation works, to rely on mutual aid structures that predated and outlived the empire. Quipus, though suppressed, did not vanish overnight. In some remote regions they persisted well into the 17th century. From this angle, the fatal blow was less a systemic flaw and more a cruel convergence of timing and opportunistic violence. A third lens emphasizes the missing middle. In Europe, by the 16th century, there existed a dense ecosystem of corporations, guilds, municipalities, and ecclesiastical bodies that could, at times, resist or cushion the fall of kings. Merchants maintained their own networks, wrote their own contracts, managed their own granaries. When one prince died, others might inherit, but the web of town charters, market privileges, and church institutions provided some continuity beyond any single crown. Tawantinsuyu, by contrast, tended to absorb or sideline such intermediate formations. Local lords were either incorporated into the imperial hierarchy or replaced, independent merchant classes were limited, long-distance trade route monopolized or tightly supervised by the state. When the imperial court imploded, there was relatively little that could step in to manage long-distance logistics and arbitration of disputes. So what pattern do we, as time detectives, draw without succumbing to the temptation of easy ideological morality tales? It is not as simple as, planning bad, markets good, nor the reverse. The Inca remind us that any system, planned or market-based, that concentrates coordination in a single, sacred center and suppresses redundancy and honest feedback renders itself exquisitely powerful in good times and terrifyingly fragile in bad. Now, why should this matter to us, in an era of satellites, spreadsheets, and digital ledgers that make quipus look quaint? Look around. In the 20th century, vast planned economies rose and fell promising order and abundance through central tallying. War communism, 5-year plans, centralized ministries tracking production targets in steel and coal, like quipus, they converted people and wheat and iron into lines in ledgers. On paper, it was neat. In practice, local realities changed faster than the center's data. Harvest failures, worker resistance, and unofficial markets scrambled any clean equation. Famines and waste followed when bad data met rigid plans. Today, our most powerful corporations run internal economies that, in some ways, echo Tawantinsuyu. Inside a giant tech firm, there is no internal money changing hands when one team uses another's server capacity or borrows a designer. Instead, there are dashboards, key performance indicators, internal tickets, digital quipus, if you like, summarizing obligations and usage. Supply chains stretch across continents, with warehouses, just-in-time deliveries, and algorithmic forecasts estimating who will need what where. A single point of failure, a server farm going down, a misconfigured algorithm, a charismatic CEO making reckless decisions, can send shocks through this network. Our food systems, too, are triumphs of coordination and exercises in dangerous minimalism. In some regions, warehouses overflow. Globally, we produce enough calories to feed billions. Yet just as the Inca discovered, abundance can be fragile. A pandemic, a war closing a strait, a climate-driven crop failure in one breadbasket region, and suddenly the carefully tuned flows look thin. Shelves empty not because the planet cannot grow, but because the system of storage, transport, and information falters. At the heart of all this lies a question the Inca would recognize instantly: who controls the ledger? In Tawantinsuyu, a quipu could, in theory, misreport a census, perhaps to lighten the mita burden on his kin, or to curry favor with a local lord. The cords were dense, the code complex, only a small circle of trained specialists could read and audit them. Their fingers and tongues mediated between the lived reality of fields and households and the abstraction of obligations to the state. Today, our ledgers are digital. Central bankers raise or lower interest rates on the basis of models only a tiny priesthood fully understands. Data scientists tweak recommendation algorithms and logistics optimizations that determine which neighborhood gets a new warehouse, which driver gets what route, which user sees which ad or which news story. Their tools are not knots but code. But the asymmetry of understanding, the distance between those who live the reality and those who encode it, remains hauntingly familiar. The Inca have not remained silent in our modern arguments. They are still invoked as evidence, called to the stand by ideologues across the spectrum. One side points to the claims of full storehouses and the absence of beggars and says, "See, it is possible to build a humane, moneyless society where everyone contributes according to their ability and receives according to their need." Another side points to forced resettlements, harsh punishments, and the violent collapse and says, "See, this is where command leads, to control without consent, and to ruin when the center stumbles." The actual record is messier. In good years, the Inca state appears to have buffered its subjects against some of the worst of Andean ecological volatility. In bad years, or politically contested ones, it could exact horrendous costs in labor and loyalty. Which story you emphasize today often reveals more about your present politics than about the past highlands. Meanwhile, the case file is still open. Surviving quipus, some 800 or so, are scattered in museums and monasteries around the world. New digital projects are scanning them in high resolution, cataloging colors, fiber twists, knot types, and positions, then using statistical methods and machine learning to search for patterns. Scholars have begun to identify what might be regional styles, administrative dialects of quipu encoding, even parallels between certain knot patterns and known place names from early colonial texts. It is possible that, within our lifetimes, we will learn to read some sets of quipus with far greater precision, cross-referencing them with surviving Spanish records. If that happens, we may find surprises, perhaps an account of a local rebellion where the quipu tells a different story than the official chronicle, perhaps mundane notes, lists of tools issued, of cloth distributed to widows, that humanize a system too often described only in abstractions. Why does that matter? Because our stories about Tawantinsuyu are not neutral antiquarian curiosities. They are ways of thinking about ourselves, about planning and spontaneity, about care and coercion, about what we owe one another in the face of risk. When a policymaker argues for or against universal basic services, when an activist dreams of post-capitalist futures, when a technocrat designs a universal digital ID system, echoes of Andean storehouses and knotted ledgers can be heard if you listen hard enough. An empire without money, markets, or alphabetic writing managed to raise terraces that still hold hillsides in place 500 years later, to run roads that hikers still follow, to coordinate millions of people without coins jangling in their pockets. And yet, when its knots and calendars failed to adapt to a stack of cascading crises, disease, civil war, and foreign invasion, the system shattered with astonishing speed, taking with it not only power but memory. The verdict I would offer you from this autopsy is simple and uncomfortable. Humans can build astonishingly sophisticated systems of coordination without money or markets, but any system that treats its own data, its own center, as infallible will eventually meet a Cajamarca. The question is not whether we choose markets or plans, it is whether we design our empires of code and concrete so that, when the unexpected comes, they can bend without breaking millions of lives. So here is where I turn the case file toward you and the present. Who, in your world, is playing the role of the quipu, those whose specialized knowledge lets them translate reality into obligations? When a statistician tweaks a poverty line, when an engineer adjusts a content moderation algorithm, when a logistics planner reroutes supply chains around a conflict zone, they are tying new knots in cords most of us never see. Join the investigation. Ask, politely but persistently, to see the ledgers, whether they are spreadsheets, algorithms, or budget lines. Demand not just transparency of data, but humility about models. Support institutions, local cooperatives, municipal governments, independent professional bodies, that can act as that missing middle, offering redundancy when central command stumbles. And finally, I want to leave you with a question no search engine can answer for you. Imagine you are that quipu in the Highland warehouse, bound at the wrists, watching soldiers tear open the baskets your knots once guarded. You know that if you teach them to read the cords, they may use that knowledge to dominate your people more efficiently. If you refuse, entire valleys may starve because no one can reconstruct the obligations in time. What do you tell them? Do you serve the logic of the system you helped build, even when it is captured? Or do you let the knots go silent and trust that your descendants will find another way to organize life among the ruins? That is not just his dilemma. It is ours, every time we decide whether to feed data into a machine we do not fully control. Until our next case, this has been Professor Adrian Lockwell, for Archives of Humanity. Keep your eyes on the knots others ignore, and I'll see you in the next investigation.